different election mechanisms are appropriate for different situations.
How it can affect the quality of democracy.
Each voter votes for exactly one candidate. In theory, that's just by that description sounds like a very nice mechanism, right? But there are problems.
If we got more votes, it is some kind of paradigmatic shift in our thinking about elections, right?
Oh, absolutely. I don't mind if the parents act like dictators at the end of the day, say override whatever the kids vote on. But in the context of, say, democratic elections, it's totally different, right?
Hello and welcome to SPOLEČNÁ, which we translate as Common Ground, the podcast of the Institute H21. My name is Ivan Jarabinski, and although I'm not the regular host, I've been given the chance to use this platform for an interview with our special guest today, Mahendra Prasad. Mahendra is a PhD candidate in political science at the University of California, Berkeley, and he came to Prague to attend our annual symposium, Democracy in the 21st Century, as a speaker. And if you missed it, that's a sort of pity, but don't worry, we are publishing the videos from this conference, from the symposium, on our institutional YouTube, so you can follow it and stay tuned. I became interested in Mahendra's through his some of his papers available online and also from some of his videos. And the reason is that his work resonates with us at the Institute because he pays attention to very, very similar topics as we do, which are how we vote and what kinds of elections might work best when choosing our representatives. But what I find especially interesting is that his approach reaches also back into philosophy and sort of forward or ahead into the field of artificial intelligence, which I'm not that proficient. So for today, I would like to talk with him about the way we make collective choices and why we make them the way we do, maybe. So welcome, Mahendra.
Welcome. Thank you for inviting me, Ivan. It's been great to be here in Prague.
Okay, Mahendra, before we dive into voting systems and collective choices, could you maybe share a bit of your personal journey? What led you to studying elections?
Okay, that's a good question. Yeah, so I was born and raised in Memphis, and I guess I was always interested in the issue of how do we arrive at ideas of collective ethics, collective rules to how to guide us, and how can we do that fairly? And I can imagine that under some election mechanisms, it wouldn't be that fair. And I thought it was very important to figure out how we could make it fair. So I think that's what really drew me to get involved in this topic. Yeah.
Awesome. So when you speak about fairness, what you consider fair electoral result, and do you think about it in these terms, like what is fair and what is not?
Yeah, I mean, I would generally think of it in terms of what's fair and what's not. In terms of what constitutes what's fair and what's not fair, I think it depends on the context. Like, for example, if you have parents might have a few kids, and they might, just to give the kids some sense of agency, might ask them to vote on what they want to do for the evening. But at the end of the day, I don't mind if the parents act like dictators at the end of the day, say override whatever the kids vote on. But in the context of, say, democratic elections, it's totally different, right? Everybody we're treating as adults and as having competency. So, I mean, different election mechanisms are appropriate for different situations. I think depending on the specific context, there are ideas of fairness that apply or don't apply in any specific context.
I know your work is, I would say, rather theoretical from what I saw so far, yeah. But you are not working on the papers like empirical comparisons or like that. But I'm still curious, how satisfied are you with the way people around the world elect their representatives? does it, I don't know, drive you crazy, or you are fine with it, just see a room for improvement or something? Like, what's your stance to
Well, I would generally say that I think for most mass elections, for single winner elections, I would say I think there could be great improvement in virtually all places in the world, because I think if you look at how people can traditionally conceive of majority rule and the purpose of majority rule, especially in terms of like philosophy, and also I guess for most people like their implicit philosophy they might be using, and then how it's actually applied in the world, I think there's a great difference, and the two don't match. I'll give an example in a second. So at least in the Anglophone world where I'm from, in like the US and the UK and whatnot, a lot of the legal foundations and philosophical foundations for democracy are based on thinkers like John Locke. In a place like France, it might be like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and so forth. But under Locke, there's this idea of like a social contract that basically you want to have the consent of the people that are being governed. And ideally, for somebody like Locke, you would have unanimous consent of the social contract that gives the agreement between the people being ruled and the people who are, practically ruling, right? And the idea is, well, okay, unanimous consent is ideal goal, but it's not always possible, in practical terms, especially when you have large populations. So, the idea of majority rule for somebody like John Locke was as a method of minimizing the number of people who have some contract or some candidate or some decision imposed upon them that they didn't consent to, right? So you want to majority rules is supposed to be an institution that maximizes the number of people that consent to the winning alternative. But unfortunately, a lot of people today, when they think of majority rule, they think of it as majority preference. So this distinction between majority preference and majority consent it's subtle, but it's important. So I'll give like an everyday example, right? So let's suppose like three friends are trying to decide where to buy, what kind of pizza pie to buy, right? Like say cheese or pepperoni. And let's say that two of the friends prefer pepperoni over cheese, but they like both the pizzas and they're glad to eat either, right? And then the third friend prefers cheese over pepperoni, but they're only willing to consent to cheese, right? Well, so what you'll notice is that the majority preference is for pepperoni, but there's unanimous consent for cheese. So, that's a relatively small decision, so it might not be that big of a deal which one wins potentially. But like, we can imagine if instead of it being, a decision between, for pizzas could be like for constitutions, right? Where let's say you have, 101 people on an island who are trying to figure out a constitution for themselves, right? And let's say there's two constitutions they're considering, X and Y. And let's say that Constitution X, 51 of the voters prefer X over Y, but they would sincerely consent to either constitution. And then 50 of the voters prefer Y over X, but they would consent only to Y, sincerely. All right. So what you'll notice, again, there's a majority preference for X, 51 to 50, just barely by one voter. But there's unanimous consent for Y. And it's a constitution, so that decides how you decide all other decisions. So I guess in theory, we'd particularly want a constitution that you have universal buy-in if such a constitution exists, or at least one that minimizes the number of people who don't consent to it. But majority preference fails to choose the constitution that has unanimous consent. And so it violates that goal of Locke, which is who's the large basis of, I guess, at least in the American context and the British context, or probably generally speaking, the social contract context, justifications of democratic governance. And it just seems that if we want to achieve the idea of minimizing the number of people who have some form of government imposed upon them to which they didn't consent, if we want to maximize the number of people who consent to the winning alternative, we need to use something that uses yes/no balloting as opposed to something that uses preference balloting, which is based like majority preference.
So basically, you're talking about collective that it better reflects collective will or general will.
I would say so. Actually, speaking of general will, if you can also look at Rousseau's, work on social contract, and if you're coming from a Rousseauian point of view, when he talks about the general will, like you're considering two different alternatives, X and Y, and which one better represents the general. When he talks about it, he says you should choose which of the two alternatives. So I'll rephrase it. So you'd have a bill that'd be in front of the Grand Assembly or whatever, right? And the Assembly would have to decide whether it conforms with the general will or not. Notice Rousseau wasn't asking, when in the Social Contract, his big book on his political theory, right? He doesn't ask people who are in an assembly to decide whether or not the bill is better than the status quo, because presumably the bill would change the status quo, which would be a preference question, right? Mm-hmm. He actually asks whether or not whether the bill being presented conforms with the general will. So if it conforms with the general will, it's an issue. I consent to it if it conforms, and I don't consent to it if it doesn't conform. So even for Rousseau, a consent maximization norm makes more sense than a majority preference.
You mentioned one of the two biggest philosophers of the last couple of hundred of years. So my question is why we are thinking about about the winners and how to select the winner in terms of majority preference rather than majority consent, when you are able to go hundreds of years back, and you're saying that they are speaking rather about majority consent, and we didn't reflect it so far.
Yeah. Well, I think it's because most of both John Locke and Rousseau, when they thought about majority rule, they were primarily thinking of it in the context of a bill. So a bill would be presented before an assembly or a parliament, and then each voter in the assembly would vote either yes or no on it. And that could also be, if it's a two-candidate race, you could potentially frame it as a preference question, or you could potentially frame it as a consent question. The thing is, when voting theorists started to look at voting mechanisms, and they were looking at multiple candidates in an election instead of just two, they started to see, well, how do we generalize this idea? And I think, unfortunately, they deviated from the ideas of Locke and Rousseau, and they shifted towards an idea of, we're thinking of this in terms of preference, not in terms of consent. And part of the reason, and also the bigger reason part of this, is that historically, there isn't much distinction. Even as recently as Rawls, who was writing in the 1970s, John Rawls, who's probably the most famous recent social contract theorist, he didn't even really make a clear distinction between majority preference and majority consent. And actually, Condorcet is one of the... So Condorcet, Nicolas de Condorcet is a French political theorist and mathematician and philosopher and French revolutionary from the late 1700s. But he became aware of the distinction between consent and preference. But for the most part, there's almost no distinction made, because historically most of the study on voting systems has been done in a preference framework. For example, probably the most famous theorem in the science of elections, election science, social choice theory, is Arrow's theorem, and that's totally within a preference framework. And there have been people like Stephen Brahms and Peter Fishburne, others who have brought into account a non-preference framework. Also, people like Belinsky and Young, but it hasn't really reached the popular discussion yet. And I think it's important for it to reach the popular discussion to realize that this is a major distinction, and while it's subtle, it's very important, and it has huge effects on real-world results.
Yeah, so what we are basically speaking about it is some kind of paradigmatic shift in our thinking about elections, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Do you think it's somehow feasible that people will try to think about it this sort of new way, and will be willing to consider maybe some, I don't know, reforms or give it a chance to think about it like this?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think there in several different contexts we already use yes/no balloting pretty extensively. For example, if you use common meeting scheduling apps, like for example Doodle, they'll basically ask you yes/no, when do you want to meet, right? And you can vote either yes or you can vote no, and then whichever time slot is the one that the most people consent to is the one that people can meet at. Or other examples are in when we measure the approval ratings of candidates, right? So one voting mechanism I study extensively is called approval voting. And under approval voting, what you do is each voter is presented a list of candidates, and then for each candidate, they either vote yes or they vote no. Basically, they're looking at each candidate as a potential social contract. And then so the percentage of voters that vote yes on a given candidate is the approval rating of that candidate, right? And basically, the candidate that wins is the candidate with the highest approval rating. And so I think approval ratings is very common in political discourse, at least in the U.S. I'm guessing it's also the case in Europe and in Czechia. But yeah, so we use it all. We use yes/no balloting already extensively in various contexts. But I mean, also like the like button on various things like YouTube and Facebook and things of that nature. So we use it very frequently. The question is it's getting people to become familiar with it, and it's actually very simple to understand. Just ask the voters to vote yes or no on each candidate. To fill in one of those two ways, and then whoever has the most yeses wins the election. And yes/no balloting is very simple and straightforward, and I think people can understand it very easily.
Yeah, it sounds to me like some kind of intuitive choice for people, and so that's what surprised me. What surprises me that some people are so defensive in change of electoral system this way in political context. So it's just a bit surprising to me. Speaking about more votes, there is often this argument, and it may be part of the problem, that if we got more votes, then we violate the principle of one person, one vote. Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with this?
Yeah.
Yep.
So that's a misnomer with respect to because it's confusion of language, right? So a more appropriate term would be one ballot, one voter, one ballot, basically, in the sense that in the social choice literature, that's the election science literature, the appropriate phrase, technical condition for voter equality, each voter basically having equal power, is what's called an anonymity condition. So basically, I'll try not to make this technical, but roughly speaking, it's the idea that who submits a ballot shouldn't matter. Rather, it's just like the number of voters that submit each ballot is what matters. And basically, because each voter should basically be treated anonymously, so that each of their ballots are basically equal. And so the thing is, each voter, under whether it's something like approval voting or D21, is basically given the same ballot, and they have the capacity to fill it out in the same manner. So any way that, if say we're voting with approval voting or for D21, and I'm filling out I can fill it out in the same manner that he fills it out, and he can fill it out in the same manner that I fill it out. But we're not required to fill it out in the same manner. It's just that we have the same powers, basically, of expression, right? We have equal and free expression. And then additionally, it's counted in the same manner, regardless of whether I submit my ballot or whether he submits the ballot. It's counted in the same manner. So we have equal voting power, and so it's one ballot, one. The reason you have that confusion about one person, one vote is that vote is used in two ways, at least in English. One is in terms of sense of like the person that's submitting a vote or a ballot, if you want to be more technical. But vote is often used to represent the word ballot. But then you also have this, I'm voting for this candidate. I'm giving my vote to this candidate. And that's the idea of like, okay, the vote goes to the candidate. And so there's voting by a voter, and there's giving a vote to a candidate. And so these two ideas get conflated, and it leads to this misperception. But really what it is each voter, in terms of their voting power, is equal. It's just that like traditional voting is what's called plurality voting, right? So in plurality voting, each voter votes for one candidate, or they list only one candidate, right? So they have one vote that they're submitting, one ballot they're submitting, but they're also giving only one vote to one candidate, right? But say under approval voting or D21, what's happening is that you're voting either yes or no on each candidate. So for each candidate, you say, okay, I choose yes or no. So candidate 1, yes. Candidate 2, no. Candidate 3, yes. But I'm choosing yes or no on each candidate. And similarly, if he's voting, for each candidate he's voting. So if you want to think of the votes, it's like whether am I giving a yes or no to each candidate. And so the confusion arises because there's different conceptions or notions of what we mean by vote. But each voter has equal voting power under voting systems like approval voting and D21. So there's not any issue with the normative principle of one voter, one person, one vote.
Yeah, this is beautiful distinction between these two ways, because often I got this feeling similar that the people are arguing about each of them are speaking about a pretty different thing, sort of. In general, I would move on because of my time pressure. But do you see any like connection between mechanics, how we select the winner, and how it can affect the quality of democracy?
Oh, definitely. Right. So I'll give one hypothetical example, right? So a very common voting system across countries is what's called plurality voting. And again, each voter votes for exactly one candidate, their top preference, and then whichever candidate is the top preference of the most voters wins the election. Now, in theory, that's just by that description sounds like a very nice mechanism, right? But there are problems, right? So suppose you have two major parties, like just for hypotheticals, keeping it simple, right? Party A and Party B, right? And let's suppose that 80% of the population supports Party A and 20% of the population supports Party B. So if you're a supporter of Party A, you will prefer any candidate from Party A over any candidate from Party B. Okay. Now, let's suppose that there are 5 candidates running in Party A, and there's only one candidate running in Party B. Now, let's say because 80% of the voters are supporting Party A, all their votes are going towards Party A, but it's split among 5 candidates. And just let's say hypothetically, for simplicity, that each candidate gets 16% of the vote. Each candidate from Party A gets 16% of the vote. But the candidate from Party B, they get 20% of the vote, right? So what happens is that if you look at the plurality voting results, is that the candidate that comes in first place is the candidate from Party B with 20% of the vote, and then the other 5 candidates each get 16% and lose. But the interesting thing to note is that if any of the candidates from Party A were to go one-on-one with the candidate from Party B, they would win 80 to 20%. And this isn't just hypothetical. There are real-world examples. So, for example, and I'm just giving this example because we have the data, because usually we don't have the data. But during the 2016 Republican presidential primaries in the United States, the Wall Street Journal had conducted, roughly speaking, monthly polls of nationally representative samples of Republican voters during the Republican nomination contest for the U.S. president. And there were, from month to month, the number of candidates varied, but typically it was 6 or more candidates and up to 17 candidates. And consistently, Donald Trump was the plurality voting winner with roughly about 20 to 25% of the first place votes. But he never was the approval voting winner. He never had the highest approval rating among Republican voters during the 2016 Republican primary contest. In fact, during the last 2 months of the last 2 polls of the Wall Street Journal polls during this nomination contest before Trump de facto won the nomination in 2016, Trump was in first place by plurality voting, but he had the lowest approval rating of any of the Republican presidential candidates. And this was from a population of voters that were solely Republican voters. And so a candidate having relatively low, approval rating, like having the lowest approval rating, winning the race because all the vote splitting that was occurring by plurality voting. And in that case, it helped a more right-wing candidate within the context of American politics. But like, for example, it can just as easily hurt a left-wing candidate because, for example, in the 1992 presidential election, there were 2 right-wing candidates running and 1 relatively liberal candidate running, and the 2 conservatives split the vote among themselves, and the liberal candidate won because they split the vote. What mechanisms that use yes/no balloting do is that they, roughly speaking, they ensure that the central tendency of the population of voters gets reflected. If that happens to be right-wing, then it's more likely to elect a right-wing. If it happens to be left-wing, it'll more likely choose the left-wing. But it reflects whatever the central tendency of the population of voters is. And I think that's very, very important in elections.
Yeah. I would go to the last question, and I would ask you, like, if there is some, I don't know, one message you would like our listeners or viewers to take away about voting. Like, what would it be?
I would say it's that preference-based voting is irrational, and yes/no balloting voting is rational. And what I mean by that is, actually in a slightly technical sense, it's just that yes/no voting is transient. It's basically you're measuring the number of yeses, and then you rank order. Socially, you rank order the candidates based on like how many yeses they have, so their approval ratings, roughly speaking. And so that's a transitive notion, right? But majority preference is not transitive, and it might be good if y'all put up a graphic for this part to show the example. But let's say you have 3 voters and 3 candidates, and say that the 3 candidates are X, Y, and Z, and you say that the first voter prefers X over Y over Z. The second voter prefers Y over Z over X, and the third voter prefers Z over X over Y. So what, when you see the graphic, what you'll be noticing is that, a majority of voters, namely the first voter and the third voters, prefer X over Y. And a majority of voters also prefer Y over Z, namely the first voter and the second voters prefer Y over Z. And so you might think, okay, well, a majority of voters prefer X over Y and a majority of voters prefer Y over Z. So that must mean that a majority of voters prefer X over Z. But if you actually look at preferences, the second and third voters prefer Z over X. So you have a situation where majority prefers X over Y, Y over Z, Z over X. That's akin to saying 3 is greater than 2 is greater than 1 is greater than 3, which is completely irrational. You can't have a largest quantity on that kind of intransitivity. Similarly, you can't have a best candidate in the sense that, X is better than Y is better than Z is better than X. That's intransitive. Now you might say, well, maybe if we use supermajority thresholds for preference, it might, but it still doesn't work. You can have an election mechanism that says, okay, if every voter but one prefers X over Y and exactly one voter prefers Y over X, then X should be socially ranked above Y. You can even show that that rule is intransitive also. So preference is not a good mechanism for making collective decision making. Yes/no balloting is a much, much better way to do it.
Okay, thank you, Mahendra. It was a pleasure to having you, and thank you also to our viewers, and we truly appreciate your time.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate y'all inviting me here, and Prague is a wonderful city, and Czechia is a wonderful country. I've met several wonderful people here. It's been a pleasure to come out here.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
bye.
Thanks.